This is a joint work with Cesar Martinelli, and the title of my presentation is Monetary and Fiscal History of Peru between 60 and 2005, Radical Policy Experiments and Inflation. So let me tell you the brief story using these charts. Here I show you the big picture and the presidents in Peru since 1963. These two were in the 70s. We also had a military junta, and then a democratic and a dictatorial government. So starting in the 60s, what is the initial point, the initial conditions? Peru was very export-based, a primary producer, a very small state. Like the government was very small. Like for example, the fiscal institutions were basically inexistent. Institutions to collect taxes, or it's a very small state. And also, we also have a massive migration from the rural areas to the cities, and it also features a huge demand for public services. You know, people entering the cities were demanding more and more public services like water, electricity, etc. And it was like in Latin America, the dependency school was in fashion. And a remarkable thing in this period, the Belaunde period, is the balance of payment crisis in 1967, where there was a 44% devaluation. I will show you some graphs of that specific period. Then comes the military junta here in the 70s. Actually, it's 1968, just after maybe it's a coincidence, but just after the huge devaluation, 44% devaluation, came unrest, and a military junta took power and introduced radical reforms, right? Like land expropriation, state capitalism, these two basic reforms, right? Land reforms and the idea was trying to increase the size of the government, right? And this is a period of fiscal expansion supported mostly by increases in debts. But remember, the revenue collecting institutions were bad, or were in its infancy. So the easy thing was to increase debt up to a point, right? Because it also had a limit, as we will see later, all right? So it's not possible to increase debt forever. This period also features the oil price shocks in '74, right? So, and it is the initial point of the inflation period, right? There's the high inflation in Peru started in 1974, right, upwards. So we have called it the Great Inflation, right? And also there was another balance of payment crisis in 74, 75. Okay, just to show you the balance of payment crisis, this is the current account deficits. This is the first one, like the one that prompted the first government, the Belaunde government, to finish. And this is the 73-74 crisis, balance of payment crisis as well. And this point also marks a change in the military government. Again, a coincidence, or maybe a process of distress and unrest in in Peru. So, yes. Yes, 10% of GDP here, and 6% of GDP negative. And then, as we will show, the 80s were full of these huge crises. Okay, so this is the graph showing how inflation became an important element in the Peruvian history. I will contrast the graphs, two countries. USA, right, the red line. So this is the axis, and Peru, the right axis, right? Just to show that, the usual story in the USA is that.
The different case. Okay.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, you know.
I was not seeing that.
Yeah, you have to see. All right.
Okay. So that's
essentially one more zero.
Up to here. Yes, exactly. Up to here, if I had to draw in the same axis, up to here, more or less the same, right? But up from here onwards, I cannot graph it in just one, in just one scale. But the key point is there's this usual story in the USA and in the developed economies, UK as well, that the 70s. End of the 60s and 70s was a period of high inflation, right? It's called also the Great Inflation period. And more or less, the big inflation, this is like less than 10%, right? Inflation per year. More or less, it starts here. And it starts increasing. This is 20% per year. And it will never stop, right? It will never stop. I cut the graph in 1985 because I just wanted to show the increase of the great inflation in Peru, right? As opposed to the story in the USA where inflation increased and then fell, in Peru, it was not the case, right? It was not the case. Okay, then came the 80s, right? And inflation was already high, and there was the first attempts to stabilize prices, all right? And in fact, you can see that in the graph, there's some stabilization of inflation right here, but 82, 83 came, but there was a bad luck. Bad shocks, Latin American debt crisis, rising US interest rates, and the El Nino shock in 83, all right? So these were, for example, El Nino is like a typical supply shock, right? Rising prices due to increases in some relative prices.
What happened exactly with El Nino? What is it exactly? It's a drought or?
It's not a drought, but it rains too much in the coast, and
so it's a weather.
It's a weather phenomenon.
For crops
Exactly. So food items are scarce, and exactly that's the El Niño phenomenon. So typical supply shock, and also we will see also in the graphs that inflation raised in this period, and GDP. Decline in 83.
Also in 1983 was the start of the big terrorist program.
Oh yeah, on top of that. Mm-hmm. On top of that, exactly. So I should mention as well, like Roberto says, that another element can be incorporated in this analysis, like the social or the terrorist group that implied higher uncertainty, right, and insecurity in the cities for citizens. Okay, and then comes the period of Garcia. Okay, Garcia is a government that was re-elected later on, and comes this experiment, this heterodox experiment or macro-populist experiment that was also very well known in Latin America. which tried to, of course, there was an intention of stopping inflation, but the key point was to redistribute income. One salient point here is that there was no regard for any budget constraint, government budget constraint, right? So that was a key point. We will see that later. And a feature of this period is that, of course, in the first 2 years of this government, due to price controls, all right, inflation did not rise at all. Actually, it fell. Maybe, like, I don't know how is the case of Chile, but in the case of Peru, for example, food, all the imports of food were the monopoly of the government, right? So public enterprises. And so it was easy to control prices in that way. Dairy products, basic food stuff. Okay, so here this is a period of, well, some people call it hyperinflation. Well, according to the formal definition of hyperinflation, like say 50% of inflation in a month, and then for various months, we just had two big increases in different months in inflation. But in general, inflation was high, like it was like 30% a month or something like that, right? So it was really high inflation, but not necessarily hyperinflation. Some people call it mega inflation.
You call 7,500 per year hyperinflation?
No, but the formal definition provided by Kagan is like in inflation in a month more than 50%, and you have to have like, I don't know how many months, like 5 months or something, higher than 50%. That didn't happen in Peru. Okay.
1 month with 200 and a few with 40 doesn't count.
Doesn't count. Exactly. And another feature of hyperinflation is that, you know, the inflation rate starts exploding, right? So we had that episode of exploding inflation, but only for brief days, right? Where the pace of inflation, of explosion of inflation was so high, it looked like you know, the German inflation of the 20s, right? But for some days, just before the stabilization of Fujimori. So in 1990, another president was elected, and yes,
no price controls.
yes,
So it was easy to...
there were price controls. Yeah, they were in act since very strong since Garcia. Okay, mildly from Belaúnde as well. All right, but from Garcia it was like a deliberate price control policy. But it was easy to perform it because they were public enterprises. You know, all the imports of food were performed by public enterprises, by monopolized, and the distribution of food as well. So it was easy to. The problem was.
I would
Yes.
qualify that because you're probably too young to remember this.
Uh-huh.
You know, there were official prices, but there was nothing to sell. I mean,
Yeah, that's why it's interesting
There
that you
was-
have this explosion, but then you either don't find these goods or
Right.
it's not recorded in the official
right.
statistics.
I mean, you think about food. You know, there was no food because there was cheap food, but there was no food. To
Exactly.
buy. I mean, that's what happens in a lot of these episodes, like Venezuela today. There's no toilet paper.
Yeah, definitely.
It is cheap. Right.
It is cheap, and for inflation records, it is those prices that count. So there's no an adjusted inflation. You know, if nobody's consuming, yes, sir.
It shouldn't count, no? Nobody buys them.
Exactly.
It should be taken out of the basket.
Exactly, it should have been taken out of, but you know, the official statistic does not take into account. I don't know if in big hyperinflation processes there was this kind of adjustment. I don't know, but it is difficult to adjust because we don't have enough, information for those periods. We only have like official statistics, right? But it is true. Most of the stuff, like food stuff, for example, were bought not in official places, but in the black markets, right? At higher prices as well. Again, we should have included those higher prices, but it's impossible to get data on those prices. Right? Okay, so the fact is, like, there was these price controls. Actually, the figures of 85 and 96, like where we had low inflation, like 6% inflation, 3% inflation per year, show that it was maybe it was due to these price control, but I don't know. All right.
Do you see very big differences between the GDP deflator and the CPI? Because that kind of
Yeah, exactly. That would be a good idea to compare both, right? I think I have yearly data of GDP deflator. Okay, so there comes the stabilization process. It was a typical. I will talk about more about this process later. There were market-oriented reforms, etc. in this period. Okay. Now the great stagflation and this comparison, which strikes me, there's this literature for the US and UK where they compare or they try to answer the question why inflation was so high in the 60s and 70s and then came down. And there are more views, but I'm choosing two here. Sargent, The Conquest of American Inflation, and this is Sargent, Williams, and Zah, The Government Beliefs and in the USA. And this story is about changing views about the inflation Phillips curve, right? So the story that the policymakers believed that there was a long-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment, but the true data generating process was like the neoclassical Phillips curve. This story of Di Cesio, I don't know if it is well pronounced, Di Cesio Nelson, it also talks about the UK and US history in the sense that the policymakers believe that inflation arose from non-monetary factors like cost push shocks. So they check official announcement and public announcement in the UK and the US and see from their writings that there was a firm belief that in UK first and in the US there was this belief that inflation was not a monetary phenomena but a non-monetary phenomena, and therefore they tried to use non-monetary policy elements. Right, and part of this story, this starts first in the UK in the 60s. Actually, the first time stagflation was used was by a finance minister in the UK in 1965. Stagflation. It is documented here, I think, one of Nelson's papers. So more or less, our story, the story that we try to tell here, accords with this story of the doctrine hypothesis for Peru as well. And I'm going to show two quotations. The first one is from Richard Webb. Richard Webb was the president of the central bank in 1980 to 1985. These guys are Harvard educated, so he studied at Harvard in 64, I think. So he was in the middle of this debate of the high inflation in the USA, etc. But he was not a monetarist, all right? He was not a monetarist. And this is in the 80s, so it is the Belaunde time, where the first stabilization attempts were done, right? But then come, maybe Roberto knows also about this book. This is a book, Heterodox Peru, an economic model, published in 1987. And this book is like the Bible of the heterodox policies in 1985, right? So here states that they didn't believe in for example, not even in a standard Phillips curve. They thought that the Phillips curve was actually had the opposite sign, right? So again, the story is that there was these beliefs, very strong beliefs of policymakers and academics. These guys are academics and policymakers. Richard Webb was also an academic and a policymaker. The Central Bank of Peru. Yes. He's one of the founders of Universidad Católica in Peru, one of the top universities, but also was the president of the Central Bank of Peru. Very young.
The president of the Argentine Central Bank said something similar not that long ago.
4 or 5 years ago.
All right. Okay, what was the diagnosis in this period? So we are like standing in 1985 or less. Okay, there was an excess supply. So they said that there was an excess supply, not an excess demand, and they based their belief on the fact that there was a capacity unused in the industrial sector. So it was like a technological thing, all right? It was not like a demand. This is sort of the output gap, the old type of output gap, no? Right? Like what is the best possible, the maximum possible outcome or production that you can get, and we were below that.
This is your interpretation of what they thought at the time.
Exactly.
We got supply curve having a negative slope.
Exactly, and it is written on that book.
Okay.
Right? There was a belief that. So here, the point was that this theory that is there is not correct for Peru. All right. So we're gonna rebuild the theory and we're gonna make policy with this. So that was the belief. Okay. So fiscal deficits were not inflationary. Quite the contrary, they reduced inflation. Right? That was the point. So inflation was already high at the beginning of 1985, right? High. So the result of this, first of all, before that, to substantiate this view of these guys, right, of the policy views, if we stand up in 1985 and draw a graph of inflation against like the output gap, the HP filter output gap, we'll have like this simple draw, all right? So, a negative relationship, right? But if we draw this same graph, but with the exchange rate devaluation, right, we see a very strong positive correlation, right? So this is in favor of the cost push shock as well, of the cost push factors of inflation. However, if
they have these plots in their book or not?
No. I'm doing this with the benefit of hindsight, right? But more or less accords with what they thought, right? Yeah. However, they don't, for example, if we just put some like dummies for periods of supply shock, like policy-induced devaluations or El Niño episode, for example. So this is the dummy, okay? We get like a standard, like nowadays, new Keynesian type, very basic Phillips curve, right? Though it's not significant, but this negative sign is not there anymore if you account for supply shocks. Again, if I put these three variables into a simple VAR, again, you can see that GDP or output gap shock implies a positive response of inflation, right? Which is also compatible with like nowadays a standard view of how it works, right?
Let me ask you something that has always puzzled.
Yes.
When you put, say, a VR, what period do you include the hyperinflationary period?
No. Only the period between 79 and 85. I'm standing at 85 and see what's driving the dynamics. Right. Okay, what is the heterodox plan? Periodic increases in real wages, so this is minimum wages, right? So this is the distributional effort, right? So increase real wages, minimum wages. They establish a huge devaluation first and then a exchange rate freeze, but with multiple exchange rates. So there was an exchange rate for imports and another exchange rate for exports, and the central bank was the one managing or administering the exchange process, right? So it was like there was an allocational position by the central bank. Control of lending and deposit rates in the banking system, right? Price controls, as I mentioned, okay? And the government was the monopoly of food imports. Massive credit subsidies, like very cheap credit for specific sectors, and the central bank credit to the public sector as well, like and to the sectorial banks, commercial banks owned by the government, and also the non-banking system, the government public non-banking system. So this all meant more and more quasi-fiscal deficits, right?
Let me just add to that list.
Yes, sir.
Debt situation. I mean, Garcia came to power in July 85, and he immediately announced that the debt service was going to be restricted to 10% of exports.
Yeah.
Right? At the time, it was about 100% of exports. Right? So that was a huge, essentially stopping debt payments. Right?
Exactly.
They have been paying since.
They had been paying during the
not defaulting the early days.
No. But Garcia said, we are going to pay this much.
That was a default.
And that actually, it's very important because, it could finance, the first 2 years of Garcia were good periods.
Exactly.
But they were being paid by the fact that, you were not repaying the debt.
Exactly. That was a default. Actually, I put it here, but then I took it out. But you're right. Actually,
all of these seem to be working the first couple of years because
there were plenty of resources. Okay, yeah, exactly, resources left over. And in terms of debt, the non-payment, the default, I started in Belaunde already. Belaunde stopped paying, but I didn't announce it like to everybody. Exactly. The consequences of this plan was effectively an initial decline of inflation and an increase in economic growth. Okay. It's a raise so there was a huge demand pool growth in 86 and 87, right? Like 6 and 9% of GDP growth, right? But all demand driven. And but the exchange rate policy that I was mentioning led to a depletion of foreign currency reserves, right? Because the central bank was granting cheap dollars to exporters and high dollar to importers, right? So there was a problem there. And also this feature monetization of ever-increasing fiscal deficits. And the problem of price controls were that those price controls were mostly done by public sector firms, right? That, as I mentioned. And it was creating huge distortions in relative prices, and also in the balance sheets of these firms, right? At some point, they had to increase those control prices, and this fed back into inflation, right? Okay, in terms of graphs, you can see that this is the this is the growth. This is per capita GDP, not growth rate. Per capita GDP started to stagnated here in at the end of in the middle of the 70s, and then these two periods of high GDP per capita GDP belong to the first 2 years of Garcia, but then there was a huge recession, right? So GDP is not, it's actually falling very high in 3 consecutive years.
But again, there must be some real exchange rate effects here, right?
GDP?
In what sense? In what?
I mean, you have a drop of GDP per capita from 4,000 to 2,800. That must be because you devalued and then.
It's in terms of dollars.
Yeah.
No, but it's constant dollars, so it isn't going to be affected by your real exchange rate.
If you look at, say, purchasing power parity, GDP per capita, it's not too different.
No? Okay, but it was good to make a.
Anyway,
Yes.
What it means in this case, Garcia actually was a disaster for Peru, in the sense that it lost about. Let me put it this way. By the beginning of the second Garcia government, which was 2010, GDP per capita in PPP terms was the same as at the beginning of the first Garcia government.
Like here.
In 1985.
They managed to get elected.
It is. Right.
It's incredible.
So Garcia II actually brought the country to where Garcia I had taken it, essentially.
Yes. And maybe I should put the graphs in terms of domestic currency as well, because this is in dollars. This is PPP dollars, I guess. But
That's taken from where? That's from the World Bank?
Yes, it should be from the World Bank or the Groningen
PPP dollars, okay.
Groningen data set. Okay. And here I graph GDP growth, which it tends to be negative in this period, the 70s and 80s, and inflation. And you can see clearly this huge hyperstagflation. The terms of trade. Okay, so this is the problem is when does this bad trend in real activity started in the 70s, but it was due to this military junta government policy types, like big huge reforms, or was the terms of trade, which also started falling in the middle of the 70s, or was it because of the bad external conditions like U.S. rising interest rates and oil price shocks? We still have to figure out what is the relative merits of these elements that affected the overall picture of GDP.
So this is constant dollars of some base, either 2005 or 2011.
Yes. Okay, so this is inflation. This is monthly inflation rate. All right, we can see again that from the 70s it became very volatile and higher in relation to like the 60s. Right, in the 70s were very volatile and high, and there are peaks in inflation rate, and these peaks are associated with devaluations. as I'll show later.
10 minutes.
Yes. Okay. So this graph I will pass. So these are the big devaluations. They have associated also peaks in inflation. And this is the fiscal deficit. It's negative, deficit positive here, associated with high debt. Okay, this is monthly inflation in the period. So these two observations. Here, where there was a huge package of monetary policy to prevent a further deterioration of the economy in 1988. So it came, for example, there was a freeze of a rise in some price controls, generated this rate of inflation.
Can we see the deficits again?
Oh, deficit. Here.
So this is, when was that? That was 80. No, that's the drop in deficit at the beginning of 85.
80 here.
Yeah. So you were like at 8% of GDP and you went down to less than 4. Is that the period we're looking at with the inflation?
Yes, this one.
Oh, that's
No,
okay.
we're
Then
talking about 88, right?
it's 88. Okay, it's in the way down. Okay.
The way up here,
Yeah.
and then.
And then that way down. Okay.
Okay.
Go back.
Uh-huh. So this is the destabilization. Okay, two observations of inflation way higher than 50%. All right. So this is monthly inflation right. But if we take out these two observations, anyway, inflation is very high and persistent, very persistent, persistently high.
Just about is this the annualized inflation by month or the actual change in a month? 400% in a month.
Yes, in a month. In a month.
1 month.
Exactly. It's not annualized, no. Okay, and this is senior age, all right? So senior age went up to 11% and then fall dramatically here, right? After the stabilization. Inflation also fell, of course, but not as quickly as other stabilization episodes. So this is the debt ratio. Okay, this is the red one is the external public debt denominated in dollars. However, maybe we need a fix here as well to make it like to adjust for changes in the exchange rate. And this is the domestic public debt, which it was mostly an external debt problem, and it is too bumpy, maybe due to
There in the 89, there is a Brady plan.
Yes, Brady plan in the 95 here.
Oh, that's a big drop.
Yes,
Okay.
Brady plan. So it went up to like 70% of GDP, the external debt, in 1988 or something, 70%. And this is the Laffer curve, similar to Diego's picture. So this is 1990, and this is 1989. Again, in the worst part of the inflation period, it is on the right-hand side of the Laffer curve. Okay, the inflation and stabilization. Quickly, there was in 1990 there was this outsider who was elected, and there was a consensus that there was a stabilization was needed, and the key aspect of the stabilization are the following: only one type of exchange rate. Remember that there were multiple exchange rates, so only one type, and the exchange rate was managed floating, monetary anchor, reduction of banking reserve, most importantly, fiscal austerity measures to reduce these deficits, right? And this is another move, an increase in public tariffs, okay? For example, gasoline increased by 3,040%, electricity raised by, I forgot here the 5 here, there's a 5,000%, water 1,000% in just 1 month. That was August 1990. Or that's why you have a huge inflation here, right? So it was mostly driven by the increasing. Yes.
They were basically zero, and then they put them
Exactly.
to an international price.
When you divide by zero,
The weight should be. That's why you get such a large 400%.
what were the tariffs? It went from 0 to what?
No, it was zero. Like some.
$1 or something, yeah.
Mhm.
Went from near 0 to what?
You mean they increased a lot. So these are the percentages. I don't remember the exact like.
Those are the prices.
Public tariff is the price of
Yeah.
gasoline and electricity.
Exact. Utilities, public utilities. Public utilities. I should
Basically, it kept them constant for several months. Inflation eroded them, and then they adjusted it
Exactly.
to an international price. Or something like that.
Exactly.
That's what just
Exactly.
brutal number.
The huge spikes that we have in August 1990 and also in 1988. There were two. Exactly. Utilities you have, utilities. Sorry about that. Yes. Okay. So, and also, so this is a fiscal movement, right? So the increasing because these companies, like public utility companies, were losing money a lot. All right. So it was like an important fiscal movement. And also the creation of the cash committee, at those times, the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy was very important. And this cash committee, which was a coordination device to follow up the government expenditures and revenues more closely, right? In order to control the deficits, was implemented was created in this period. All right. So as a result, the seigniorage was reduced very rapidly in 1, 2, 3 years to levels much lower than before. All right. So I took this picture from Sargent, Williams, and Sa from their paper of the conquest of Latin American inflation. So they have a picture of seigniorage as well, and the implied seigniorage in their model. So the reduction here in seigniorage is not that strong as compared to the data that we have. Look, it takes more time to. The bar is their data. I don't know how they got that data.
They didn't. It's implied by the model.
The bars.
Sorry.
The bars are the data, and the implied by the model is the line, with the band, right? So, as opposed to the data that we got here, so there are some differences, right? Yeah. And they use this fact to establish, for example, that the reforms were cosmetic, right, in the paper, because there was, the reform was not a fundamental reform. All right. So our belief is that no, I think the stabilization attacked the fundamental problem that was the fiscal deficit, right? In our view, in our paper that we're managing. However, obviously there were problems because
You have 1 minute.
Yes, in 1 minute I will do this.
Okay.
All right. There were problems. For example, the cash committee took time to implement, And monetary policy at that time did not have instruments to operate. It's like, for example, to sterilize government intervention to manage the exchange rate. No instrument at all to sterilize. Very difficult. And there was still lack of coordination between the central bank and the Ministry of Finance. The fully fledged managed floating implemented, it took time to implement. It was implemented in 1991. And I guess that is what I want to say.